have Benjamin Morgan, Mark Williams, Minal Pathak, and Bill Brown in conversation with Navroz Dubash. Benjamin Morgan is an associate professor of English at the University of Chicago. He focuses on literature, science, and aesthetics in the Victorian period and early 20th century. His book, The Outward Mind, Materialistic Aesthetics in Victorian Science and Literature, explores how 19th century sciences of mind and emotion generated new and controversial explanations of the human experience of the arts. Mark Williams is a professor of paleobiology at the University of Leicester in the UK and formerly a scientist with the British Geological and Antarctic Surveys. Mark is interested in the evolution of the biosphere, especially its current trajectory of change in the Anthropocene. He has been involved in the research for over a decade as a long-time member and formal secretary of the Anthropocene Working Group. He has written The Goldilocks Planet, Ocean Worlds, Skeletons, The Frame of Life, The Anthropocene, a multidisciplinary approach. Minal Pathak works as senior scientist in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. She also coordinates activities at the Global Center for Environment and Energy at Ahmedabad University and focuses on low-carbon cities, scenarios assessment, transportation decarbonization, and urban resilience. She's the lead author on the second assessment report on climate change in cities coordinated by Columbia University's Earth Institute. Professor Pathak is also a visiting researcher at Imperial College London and has held visiting scholar positions at the Department of Urban Studies and Planning, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and University Technology Malaysia, Johor Bahru. Bill Brown is a professor in the Department of English Language and Literature at the University of Chicago, with an interest in popular literary genres and the ways that mass cultural phenomena impress themselves out on the literary imagination. He has worked at the intersection of literary, visual, and material cultures. Currently, he's working on a project called Reassemblage, which asks how assemblage practices across the literary, visual, and plastic arts might contribute to assemblage theory in the social sciences. Navroz Dubash is a professor at the Center for Policy Research and has been actively engaged in debates on climate change, air quality, energy, and water for over 25 years. He was instrumental in establishing the Global Climate Action Network in 1990 and has since widely written about climate policies and governance. Navroz is currently coordinating lead author on national and subnational policies and institutions for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, serves on the UNEP Gap Report Steering Committee, and has been a member of the Scientific Advisory Group for the United Nations Climate Change Action Summit in 2019. He informs and advises the Indian government on environmental policy and serves on various policy committees, including the Committee on a Long-Term Strategy for Low-Carbon Development for India. He has written 2 books, edited 10 volumes, and published more than 70 journal articles and book chapters. In 2015, he was conferred with the T.N. Khoshu Memorial Award for his work on Indian climate change policy and the International Discourse on Global Climate Governance. In 2018, his paper entitled India's Energy and Emissions Future, an interpretive analysis of model scenarios, was awarded the Emerging Nations Award by the Environmental Research Letters. His most recent work is an edited book, India in a Warming World, Integrating Climate Change and Development. Let us welcome our panelists today up on the stage with a huge round of applause.
My name is Navroz Dubash, and it's my great pleasure today to moderate the conversation that we have scheduled for climate change in the Anthropocene. Just very briefly, by way of introducing this conversation, I think many of you may have been over at the session we just had, the conversation between Amitav Ghosh and Professor Dipesh Chakraborty. It's extraordinary to those of us who work in this area in India that the Kolkata Lit Fest has 3 panels on climate change, which is, I think, a sign of growing attention and interest, which is wonderful. This panel adds a little bit of an angle to this discussion by locating it within this broader discussion of the Anthropocene, the idea that we are entering an epoch where humanity is a force that is being recognized at the geological level on the way in which this planet operates. We'll talk about that a little bit more and its significance. And this panel is actually uniquely qualified to kick off this conversation. We have a scientist, we have a policy scientist, we have humanities scholars, so we can talk about this issue in a range of ways. Bill Brown in the middle of the panel there, actually in our prior conversations, had provided me an interesting phrase that I think helps us set up this panel. What he said is that it is both important to know climate change as well as to feel what it actually means. And both of these are challenging things to do. How do we understand and know, and how do we actually feel the implications of climate change as a prelude to action? So those are the kinds of themes that we're going to try and pick up on this panel. And I'll try and make sure we leave as much time as possible for questions. Just to the organizers, when do we have until? About 45 minutes. Okay. All right. So we're looking at 2, little bit past 2? Okay. All right. Let's kick this conversation off, actually, by first turning to Mark, who has been part of the Anthropocene working group trying to define what this concept of the Anthropocene means. So would you maybe just explain the concept to us and why it's such a significant way of framing issues like climate change?
Okay, it's very nice to be here. I'm a geologist, so I studied the history of planet Earth, and it's a long history. It's been here for 4,500 million years. And to make sense of that time, I try to recognize divisions of time when the Earth has gone through very considerable changes. So sometimes it's gone into states which have been completely encased in ice. Other times it's gone into states when it's been very warm. In looking at that long history of evolution of the planet, looking at changes to the Earth, to the atmosphere, to the oceans, and also looking at changes in life, what we can see is if humans have been here for about 3 million years in one form or another, or our group of species. If we now look, though, at the impact that we've had on the planet over that 3 million years of time, and we now measure it versus the impact that we've had on the planet over the past 70 years or so, then there has been a huge acceleration, for example, in our impact on the way in which we've caused extinctions, in which we've redistributed species around the planet, so many invasive species, tens of thousands of invasive species, the way in which we've had a major impact on the oceans through ocean acidification, through overfishing, the way in which we've reconfigured the atmosphere, and the way in which we've reconfigured the land, so the Earth. So all of the major components of the Earth system, we've had a huge impact over the past 70 years. And the impact is so great, and the physical signal of that impact is so great. For example, if I go to a river or a sea, I look at the sediments, I can find plastic deposits everywhere on this planet. That impact is so great now that it is comparable to the major changes to the Earth system that I can recognize in very deep time. And because that impact is human, we think we should be designating a new epoch of geological time, and we should be calling that the Anthropocene.
Great, thank you very much. Maybe I can ask Minal then to sort of take us through a little bit, locate this discussion of the kind of epochal changes that humanity is sort of wreaking on the Earth, and relate it to the conversations that we've been having about climate change. What are the ways in which we're beginning to tell the story about climate change and its impact? And maybe you could also touch on a little bit the process through which we come to these conclusions that we share with the world through panels like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, because these are complex ideas and we have to have some convergence around them.
Yeah. Hi, good morning, and I'm also delighted to be here, and I've not spoken at such a beautiful venue ever. And like Navroz said, just to be invited to be a climate scientist, a researcher, and to be invited at the literary festival is an absolute honor. Your question has many layers, but let me quickly tell you that the understanding of climate change is not very new. At least in the policy circles, global policy circles, we've known about climate change for about 30, 40 years now, right? But in the last 10 years especially, the conversation has gained momentum, and one of the reasons is the shrinking carbon budget and the associated impacts of climate change. So these are experienced in our day-to-day lives in terms of extreme temperature, in terms of extreme events, sea level rise, coastal changes. So people are experiencing this. So this has sort of brought this awareness to the forefront. In fact, if somebody told me this 2 years ago, that there will be thousands of people marching on the streets for climate change, I would have almost thought that was fiction. But that was real, right? That's happening now. So I was contributing to a report of the IPCC. You may have heard of the 1.5 degree report. So it was released in 2018 and approved by 195 member governments of the United Nations Climate Change Panel. And the report clearly mentions that we have about a carbon budget that might last up to, say, the next 10-15 years, beyond which we could witness catastrophic impacts of climate change. So if we want to stay within the limit of 1.5 degree global warming, then we need to take urgent and rapid measures at every scale, global, national, local, and the individual. So very quickly, I'll touch upon Navroz's last question on how do we know? So we know through the science of climate change. We've known through historical records, through tree rings, through bubbles trapped in ice cores, right? Through geological records. We also know because of the extreme events that we are looking at. And so the 1.5 report sets out evidence, and IPCC is a unique process in which governments call out for the reports. The scientists produce, and Navroz is one of the authors of such a report. The scientists produce this, and the summary reports are approved line by member governments. So it's a unique science policy process, and it's transparent. So any of you could go to the IPCC website, access these reports, access previous drafts, access government comments, and question the science, and we would have to respond to every individual comment. So I'll stop here, and maybe we can come back to this later.
No, great. Thank you, Minal. It's worth emphasizing this point. There's a really interesting intersection between science and politics because, as Minal says, literally every line of the summary is reviewed by governments, commented by governments, and in some senses they ask for clarifications, they ask for a shift in emphasis, it has to be scientifically appropriate. It's quite an interesting process, and I think something analogous, but within the science, is happening with the Anthropocene working group, where there's a lot of refinement and debate over the idea in that process. I just want to turn to Bill and to Benjamin, perhaps, to engage with. We've heard about sort of how these ideas are developed, how they're refined, how they're sort of inserted into the political process. How are they then transmitted and engaged with by the broader world? We've just heard from Amitav Ghosh, where he sort of wonders whether scientists are the best messengers. And I think a slight pushback from Dubash, who says, well, maybe they're not the best messengers, but they're essential to the process. Maybe you can reflect on that tension and reflect on how the broader communication and engagement happens with the public from your vantage point as humanities scholars.
Yeah, sure, thank you. And I want to repeat what my colleagues have said, that it's such a pleasure to be here. Our view is extraordinary, I got to say. I think that the question about the message is always a question about who's receiving the message, and clearly when it comes to policy, it is governments that need to receive a message, and they need to receive it in a certain form. That's a different thing from the recipient being a large number of people, a population or one constituency or another. And what I'm very interested in when it comes to our particular topic, and that is the Anthropocene, is the way it makes me recognize, especially when we have scientists here at a literary meet, that scientists produce lots of good science, but they also really are practicing a kind of language art, right? I mean, scientists name for us planets, they name for us new creatures on the earth, they name for us new elements, they name for us, as it turns out, epics. This is a new name for an epic. And so I think the question then becomes, does this have any potency, does this have any power? And it remains the case that the international stratigraphers and geologists haven't confirmed that there's not unanimity that this is the case, right? That this era should be called what it is. There's certainly no unanimity about when it begins. But what I think is clearly the case is that outside those communities of science, the Anthropocene has had a huge impact as an idea. So that we do have anthologies now. Philosophy responds to the Anthropocene. Art and the Anthropocene. Poets responding to the Anthropocene. So I think the capacity for a name like that to reify a condition is point one, a way of just producing a different kind of attention. And that attention in this instance is decidedly, the attention I'm talking about is not from the scientific community, but from the arts and from the humanities. The other thing that I think is potent about that particular term is it gives us some sense, or I think it can and has the capacity to give us some sense of what it means to be a species. Right. I mean, it's very difficult in our day-to-day lives to think of ourselves as anything more than individuals. If we do, maybe we think of ourselves as members of a family or members of a city or a town. Not so often a member of a species. But that term insists that we think of ourselves, or if we succumb to the term, it insists that we think of ourselves also as part of a species, and I think that really can trigger a significant relay between individual thinking and species thinking.
Great. Benjamin, would you like to add to that, and perhaps also kind of communicate to the audience kind of the nub of why this term has seized the imagination of poets, humanities scholars, and others who are engaged in the world of ideas?
Yes, thank you for that question. I'll just echo everyone else in saying this is extraordinary to be here. It's really unusual that a term from the sciences should have such traction in the humanities. We don't usually get that worked up when physicists are naming new things. We don't have controversies in literary studies about whether something is a planet or not. So the fact that this concept, this term, the Anthropocene, to name a new era of geological time, took off in the humanities is a very exciting but also controversial event. As to why that's the case, I think it's because the Anthropocene immediately was clear as not only a division of geological time, but also a division of human history. And so it's a concept that necessarily brings together a historical consciousness and also a scientific or geological consciousness. And I don't think we can understand the term without both of those participants in the conversation. So we need people from the humanities who think historically, and also people from the sciences who think in the longer arcs of Earth history in order to really fill out what this term Anthropocene means and what it means for us.
Right. No, thank you. I want to sort of, anytime you have a term like this, and the climate debate is riddled with terms that are technically complex, but that also are then kind of brought to earth in ways that allow one side or another in a debate to sort of harness and appropriate them. So Minal talked about the carbon budget, right? So we have a finite amount of carbon that we can burn from now until forever. And it is about 1,000 gigatons of carbon, which is an abstract number. But it turns out that countries can squabble over how much each of us should get, right? So something that is a term about how we have finite amount of carbon we can burn is also turned into something that is a political battle over how much, who gets to use how much of it. And I think similarly, a term like the Anthropocene can be used as, is also being fought over, if you like. And maybe Minal can kind of reflect a little bit on the fact that in climate change we have this history of north-south politics. The South is likely to bear the brunt of the impacts. Historically, the North has emitted much more than the South, though of course the South is now catching up, led by China. And we've had this debate. How does the Anthropocene and an idea like that feed into this conversation?
So just to add a little more technicality to this also. So when I was just speaking it to school students yesterday, and I was just looking up the data, and so when my mom was born, the carbon dioxide level, let me start with my grandmother. So when my grandmother was born, the CO2 levels were around 300 parts per million. So for every million parts of air, you have 300 parts of CO2. When my mom was born, it was about 313. When I was born, it was close to 320, 330. When my daughter was born, it's 400. And 450 is the number which is our absolute threshold. So that's the change we have made in this very short period of time. And it's everything we do. It's the way we move, the way we live, the houses we build, the food we eat, the stuff we buy, where we buy from. So it's a huge impact. Now, the debate that I've been hearing often, very often in the Indian policy circles, is that we did not create the problem. It was the industrialized nations that emitted all this CO2, and we are experiencing the impacts of this. So while science moved from evidence to numbers to urgency to action, there's this other community which moved from stages of ignorance, avoidance, skepticism, protecting rent-seeking business models, stalling action, right? So how do we respond to such a question? But I think my only take is that we have lost the time to play the blame game. It's just time for action. And we can no longer say it's not our problem, it's collective problem. And Anthropocene is one such framing which helps us think at a planetary level. That it's not just about us, it's not about a country, it's at the national level. And India depends on its resources for development. So you can't disconnect development and climate. So I think that blame game, we don't have time to play blame games anymore. But I know, Navroz, that I read the first chapter of your recent book, and you have an interesting take on it. So if I can push the question back to you.
Well, I think I want to save the time for the moderator, so I'll thank you for that prompt. Maybe I'll take a second to say that I think that's for us in India discussing climate change, this is a hump we need to get over. Historically, we've always said, you know, sort of a pele-up approach. You guys go first, we'll follow at some time in the future. We now have a shrinking carbon budget, and at some point when the pie is so small, the discussion over how you slice it up becomes less and less meaningful. At the same time, many of the things that we could do for climate change are also things that we could do for development. Better public transport will just make for better cities and also help climate change. So that's another way to think about it. And many of us, Minal and myself, certainly have been involved in some of these political and policy debates. I just want to turn it back to Mark to ask, when you were in the Anthropocene steering group, you had a very different set of questions, you know, sort of technical questions about what is the dividing line, how do we know this is a new epoch, and so on. Did these politics intrude? Did people worry about terms like the Anthropocene becoming a political football? Was that discussed?
No, it wasn't. So when we put the Anthropocene working group together in 2009, we put it together to assess this from a purely geological perspective. And actually, the Anthropocene working group, there are a little less than 40 of us, and we include geologists, geographers, archaeologists, historians. We even have an international lawyer. But always, at every stage, it's been a scientific discussion. So we've been aware of the politics, and we've been aware of the interest. And I think when we began this process, I think if you Googled Anthropocene, you maybe got 300,000-400,000 hits. So it was already quite a widespread term. But I think if you Google Anthropocene now, you'll get 3 million hits straight away. So it's become a huge subject of discussion. And well, I never thought I would be sitting here talking with you today as a geologist, but that's a brilliant experience to have. So we've always kept the geological side of it completely separate from the politics, because we have to do that. And as a geologist, if I'm going to assess where in the physical stratigraphical record of the accumulation of rocks on this planet over time, where would I define an Anthropocene? I have to look at it dispassionately. I have to make a case scientifically, because that case is obviously then going to be judged by many other scientists who are going to say yes or no to that decision. So it always remained a dispassionate, scientific, objective process, though we're obviously also fully aware of the political dimensions.
Great, thank you. I think quite soon we'll turn it back to the audience, but I want to have one round of comment. Please feel free to comment on any of these other things, but in particular, maybe starting with Benjamin this time, because these topics are so complex, so let's just sort of take climate change specifically. Can you give us a couple of examples of your favorite instances or pieces of work where you think people have communicated effectively about this in ways that allow people to actually cross over from knowing to feeling what this actually means?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So one of the things that I study is art and literature that takes climate change as its topic. There's a piece that I often share called a high water line that's very simple. It's simply a artist who walked around the streets of New York and Brooklyn and Manhattan and drew a line in the street where flooding would happen during catastrophic floods. And part of the aim of the project was to use the urban space as a medium to show people within their lived environments where catastrophic flooding would happen, and also to educate them on the increasing frequency of these floods. And the thing that I like about that piece is how sort of straightforward and simple it is. In a way, it goes back to the origins of drawing and painting and art, only drawing on the street. And I think that simplicity of that piece is very powerful. Yeah,
it's a great example. Bill?
Yeah, well, we now have a body of fiction that isn't called sci-fi, but it's called cli-fi, climate fiction, and a best-selling example of that is Kim Stanley Robinson's New York 2140, which is about an utterly flooded, inundated New York. And what's somewhat interesting about it, but I think also problematic, is it becomes a story about certain kinds of resilience. But what has been interesting to me since I've been thinking about climate change as a problem, and since I have for a long time taught popular fiction, is the way in which a long history of science fiction has given us a way of thinking about the planetary and moving from the local to the planetary. And so, as I said yesterday, talking to the high school students, if it could be an alien invasion, it could be a meteor, but if it's landing on Mumbai or New York or LA or Barcelona, it's not presented as a local problem, although it is that, but it's presented as a planetary problem. So I think there again, just as with trying to develop a species consciousness coming from a single word, the Anthropocene, so too I think the capacity to think the local and the planetary at once is something that, in fact, popular fiction, and some of it not really very good fiction, has been encouraging us to do for a long time.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all for this stimulating conversation so far. I think let's turn it over to the audience. Maybe we'll just collect 2 or 3 questions together and then ask the panel to respond. So please, the lady in the front, and then I think gentleman halfway down there, and then over to you.
Yes, my question is for Minal Pathak. You mentioned having a conversation with school students. Can you tell us more about how that went and how these future policymakers can be sensitized to climate change to actually take action and not only just learn about it in their syllabus?
Thank you. Gentleman back there.
Good afternoon, everybody. My question is very specific. Can you tell what is the role of use of plastics in these present days climate change? What is the role of use of plastic?
Okay. Please, and then we'll come back to you. These 4 questions, and then we'll pause.
And this question is for Benjamin. And you mentioned something regarding history. And Anthropocene as a term that is loaded with the history of man. Now, this is itself a dual and a separation. So I'm wondering, how do we actually advance towards kind of similar goals here by calling it anything at all?
Okay. It's a provocative question. Thank you.
I have 2 things to ask actually, just to ma'am actually. Ma'am, the recent failures at the COP25 and the climate agreements are being worked from 1992 onwards, but ma'am, we haven't made much progress as such. A lot is talked about, a framework is decided, but not much gets done, and then we all just close down the targets and then again plan out. Ma'am, is there some particular framework thing which goes wrong, that why climate agreements don't work in today's world, actually? If you would mind.
Okay, great. Let's turn it back to the...
Just one more thing, actually.
Okay, very quickly, please.
Yeah, just the Anthropocene thing, actually. I just couldn't get the distinction of the planetary and the local thing, which was being trying to point it out. It was being pointed out by sir. Could you please just elaborate on it?
Okay. I've just happily been told we have until 2:15, and the panelists have been very disciplined, and I've kept them on a very tight leash, so you should feel the leash loosen a bit. So please feel free to kind of elaborate a little bit more and pick up on strands from these questions. Minal, do you want to start with a couple?
Yeah, I'll start with the first question, and thank you for this very interesting question. It wasn't my first time speaking with school students, and increasingly I'm finding that much more rewarding than my day job. because I think young people today, we are learning a lot from them. It was an incredible experience, and after I finish, maybe if the others want to add, because they were there too, they were asking me really difficult questions. They had some great suggestions, and on your question of whether it can make a difference, I think yes. I think it's a great idea for younger people to call out to the older generation, and I count myself as the older generation, to hold us accountable. So I think we need more young people taking charge, because obviously we haven't found a great solution. I think call out to people, call out to decision makers, but also within your family. And I think when you go back, I think it starts at the individual level as well, right? If you are responsible, if you understand the science, if you make an attempt, you sort of generate a positive chain reaction, and that's what's happened globally. And I think it's a great parallel. And I was talking to Navroz that we can't do it without the state. So you do need some sort of top-down policy regulations. But I think this is a great thing to sort of fire on the action. And I think because this is such a pessimistic topic to talk about, shrinking budgets and rising seas, I think this is what energizes me and what I do. So I think we need to keep going at it.
Okay, thank you. Bill, can I turn to you? You had a clarification right at the end there that maybe you can...
Yeah, the clarification about the local and the planetary. I mean, it's very simple, and that is, if you're in Santa Rosa, California, and you lose your horses to a fire, right? That's a local problem, but it's also a planetary problem. And so I think it's what I'm suggesting is that a long history of science fiction, a lot of it popular fiction, has shown us the way to leap from the hyperlocal, as it were, oh my God, the front lawn is starting to burn, to the planetary. The planet is at stake, as it were. So that's all I mean.
Feel free to elaborate if any of the other questions that you'd like to pick up on.
Well, I would like to also talk about those students yesterday, and I assure you, they came motivated, right? I mean, they had very aggressive questions, and important questions, and they were quoting from Donald Trump, and they were asking about how to cope with their parents and their grandparents, and I think increasingly, my feeling is, I think most people's feeling is that, they know and they're motivated, and the question is, what to do, right? What action to take. And I think it is also the case that we have democratic nation states who are contributing horribly to the ruin of the climate, and democracies are led by, right now, people who are leading in the wrong direction, but they are elected by people. And so I think it is really indeed a matter of changing enough people's minds so that different leaders get elected. Yeah.
Did you want to add something, Minal?
No, I wanted to respond to the last question, but were you planning to?
Yeah, let's just maybe take a couple of the others. We'll come back to that collectively. Please, maybe the question on plastics and I think you had a couple of other responses you want to make.
So I'd just like to respond also because yesterday was brilliant, and I saw an army of Greta Thunbergs actually marching in that room. And the fact that you're asking these questions, when I was your age, I wouldn't have even been thinking about this. And so it's brilliant for us. Now, you really give us faith because we think your generation will be much more motivated to solve the problems that my generation has created. So that gives me faith. So I'm really happy about that. If I could, there was a question about why should we name the Anthropocene? What is the value of it? And so up above us we can hear birds singing, and it's wonderful because it's reminding us of the biosphere. But birds are dinosaurs, and they're directly related to dinosaurs. And 66 million years ago, this planet was hit by a gigantic asteroid, and it wiped out the non-bird dinosaurs. The reason we're having this conversation today is because that allowed the mammals to proliferate and become a dominant force on the planet, and that's the reason we've come to humanity. Now, for me as a geologist, I have to have a framework by which I can tie together all of these different events over 4.5 billion years. Otherwise, it would be chaos for me. And it's actually the greatest contribution of my science is that we have an understanding of how the Earth system has evolved over time. Why do I think it's very important to define the Anthropocene? Because if I look at any component of it, and my main speciality is to look at how life has evolved on this planet, I would say that the human impact on this planet, in terms of the way that we're reconfiguring life, is the greatest impact for 540 million years. And I would say that because that event, 540 million years ago, is when the biosphere gives rise to animal life. It's a major fundamental change in the reconfiguration of the whole biosphere. Humans are doing that at present. There are 7.7 billion of us. And if you think about the mass of humanity and the mass of the animals that we use to support us and the mass of the crops that we use to support us, we have completely and wholesale reconfigured the food web on this planet. It's really fundamental. And also I can see a physical record of that. If I can take you anywhere on this planet now and I can show you in the accumulating sedimentary succession the human imprint everywhere on the planet. That's why I think it's so important.
Could you just add, if you don't mind, what you told me this morning about the number of chickens that we have proliferated as an indication of the way in which we have our footprint is diverse?
So it's one physical example of this is this reconfiguration of the biosphere is the number of chickens that we consume each year as a species. So we eat 63 billion chickens every year on this planet, and at any one point in time there are 21 billion chickens. That's an order of magnitude greater than the greatest wild population of birds, which is about 1.5 billion for the next most populous species. So 21 billion at any one time also gives you an indication of how fast this turnover is, if we're eating 63 billion of them each year. Because the way we've reconfigured this species is that it lives for 6 weeks, and then it's cold, and then it gets to the factory within a couple of days, and then it's consumed. And it's consumed with impunity. We don't think about the chicken at all. And that's a fundamental change, with a physical record that I can see of change in the sedimentary record.
Benjamin, did you want to react to the question about history and so on?
Yeah, I'll just quickly say, because I'm very eager to sort of draw the connection between literary studies or literature and the sciences, which I think is not always obvious. For me, I write articles and books about the British 19th century literature. So it's very surprising that climate change is a topic that I would be interested in or writing about. But one thing that I mean when I say that it's a historical concept, the Anthropocene, is that it totally changes the way we understand not only our present and our future, but also our history. So looking back at the 19th century, at the transition to a fossil fuel economy, it forces me to totally re-understand all of the things that I study as leading towards this present moment. And I think that's one of the really galvanizing things that the Anthropocene has done, is that it's created a new historical narrative that allows us to think about our pasts in a different way.
I wanted to come back to this question about, your question about sort of action a little bit after discussing some of the things about how we know and how we feel. So maybe let's sort of loop back and say, with the benefit of this discussion about what do we know, how do we know, and then how do we kind of relate to it, maybe that can shed light a little bit on this question of action and invite all the panelists, maybe starting with Minal, to reflect on this. And then if you guys don't mind, I'll take a minute myself.
Do you want me to respond on what do we know and on the global framework question?
Well, I think there's skepticism that the global framework is getting us anywhere, and maybe one can reflect on why that is in the context of some of the discussions we've been having.
So, I mean, this question of justice and fairness, we get it all the time. And I think there are 4 central questions to this. One is who created the problem? The second one is who has the ability to solve it? Who decides what to do and who pays for it? I think centrally all the discussions and the disagreements are around these 4 questions, right? So I already mentioned up front that we don't want to discuss about who created the problem because it's non-existent now, right? Now, if it's the time to take action, then who has the ability to solve it? And in a global framing thing, I think the developed countries do have the technologies to solve it. So like Navroz might also add to this, is that if there were a global framework where there was a strong technology and finance support from developed to developing countries, that would be one element. It's easier said than done, of course. And then the other question is who decides what to do. And how do you decide whether you should take individual actions, which countries should ban coal? I mean, because it's not so simple. It's a very complex problem. So it doesn't have a very simple one-line solution. But I still think, and I was talking to Dubash yesterday, that there is still hope. And so we are hopeful that it's possible. I agree with you that current global agreements are weak. So just to support your statement with a scientific fact, if all the countries lived up to their Paris Agreement ambition, we would be at 3 degrees. And that's twice as much temperature increase as we want to be. So we agree that it's not going to, and that is also a big if countries meet all the pledges that they have made. Many will, but few won't. So I'll leave it here, but maybe we can come back to this one.
Okay. Any of the panelists want to add anything on this? I might just reflect that, just sort of throw something out. Now I'll have my chance because unfortunately, if you stick around, I'm on the next panel as well as a speaker, so I might elaborate there. But I think there's an interesting tension here. The climate change, especially embedded in this incredibly large concept of the Anthropocene, makes us kind of pull back the lens and look at the whole problem together. And then, in fact, as Minal says, it is who caused it, how do we decide, and so on and so forth. But the steps that we take to address climate change are actually the sum total of many little steps. Do I eat another chicken today? Do I walk or do I drive? Do I vote for this government or that government? So steps as a consumer, steps as a citizen, steps as a member of a community. And I think the pathway to change is actually through all those little steps. Now, people are really worried that the sum of all those little steps won't get us to the big picture. But other people are worried that focusing on the big picture will just lead to paralysis. And I tend to now swing towards the first part of it, that immediate action, however small, is more important than worrying about whether it'll add up. Because immediate action sometimes leads to its own dynamics. So you start small and then, a number of people start moving to public transport and transportation emissions go down. You change the way you imagine your cities. So there's a real tension. So how we understand and how we know is very closely tied to action. And as long as we keep thinking about this as a problem that requires 192 countries to sit around in a room with simultaneous translation on and carve up the carbon pie, I don't think we'll solve this problem. But I'm sorry, I couldn't resist the speaking as the moderator on this point. But I think let's take another round of questions and we come back to the panel. Let's just, we will take it in the next round. Let's just see if we have another round. I will come back to you, but let's just see if we get a couple more questions before we give you a second go. Yes, please.
Can you just tell us very briefly how you detect this whole impact of chickens in your field? Like, what's the impact you see in the rocks?
So,
just take a couple. Sorry. One question over there. Yeah.
Hello. Yeah, can you comment on the connection between the overpopulation and the climate change? Because I think that's the most fundamental connection I can see from where I am looking, staying in India and say China as a neighboring country.
Okay. One more question on this side of the aisle and then we'll come back to you in front.
Yeah, hi. I'd like to know, since you said about chickens, to rather be vegetarian all the times, because the chickens are having the corns, to rather have corns ourselves, so we'll be saving the chickens in that process.
Okay, and back to this, the lady in the front. Let's just take her question, I think, and then we'll add you as well.
My question is for Benjamin. So, in a country like India, science and humanities have always been very separate streams. So, how do you think the merging of these two separate circles can have a positive impact on action against climate change?
All the way at the back, please. Last question for this round.
A very good afternoon to all the panelists. It's an open question and I would like all four of you to answer it if possible. We were talking about climate fiction and cli-fi. So it's a very inquisitive part on my thing that I wanted to know that reading literature the 19th century literature and reinterpreting it in this age, can it shed any light on the fact that way climate was being manipulated and pollution and things were being done in the 19th century England? Can literature written during that era, could those be reinterpreted or read right now? And how has the development of climate fiction has intensely gone to contributing towards building an awareness against the problem of climate change?
Okay, great, thank you. Maybe let's start with you, Mark, because we also have a residual question from the previous session on plastics, and maybe you can combine that with the chicken and rocks question.
Actually, the plastics and chickens combine really well because often your chicken is wrapped in plastic when it comes to the supermarket. So to start with the chickens, so over the past 6 decades, we've increased the individual mass of chickens fourfold. And as a result of that, we've actually changed their anatomy. So their bones have changed very considerably. So if you go to a landfill site where because we've not been good at recycling things, and if you look at the stratigraphy of the landfill and of the bones accumulating in that landfill, then you can see a physical change in the fossil record of the chickens because their bones have basically got bigger but weaker, paradoxically. So there is a physical signal there. And one of you asked about plastics too, if I can link the two. So in nature, there are materials that resemble plastic, so cellulose in plants, for example, and it persists in the geological record over hundreds of millions of years. I could take you to a rock succession from 500 million years ago. We could break down the rock. We would find cellulose-like materials in it. So it's a big problem because plastics are likely to persist in the geological record for hundreds of millions of years and to be a signal of you and I long after you and I exist as a species on this planet. But it's a much bigger problem than that because the plastics are now completely pervasive. So every time you put your clothes in your washing machine, the plastic fibers in those clothes will be washed into the water system. There will be millions and millions of fibers each time you wash. That's accumulating in a whole series of different natural systems, way down onto the abyssal plains of the oceans. It's finding its way back into the food chain. And we have absolutely no way of knowing what's out there or what its environmental impact will be. So it's a major geological and environmental issue. Don't really know how to add to that. As a both.
Okay, thank you. I can't resist just this very small addition on the chicken story. I had when I was a student, I had a friend who was studying the chicken industry as a geographer, and they used to have these trade magazines on chicken development and chicken sort of modification. And the big selling chicken in the US at the time was something that was called the Yield Master male. And because it had this enormous chest, so it yielded more breast meat, which was what the US market wanted. The only problem was this chicken had such an enormous chest that it couldn't sexually reproduce. So, but because it yielded so much meat, it actually outperformed all other chickens. So then we created a chicken that wouldn't last one generation in the wild, but was actually the most successful chicken in our economy. So it's sort of an interesting irony about how we manipulated these systems. Would you like to? So actually, maybe let's just take the question about science and humanities that was addressed to you.
Sure. Yeah, I love that question because it's one that I think about a lot. What could the sciences do? Do the sciences working with the humanities offer us hope or a way forward with some of this? I think. Again, thinking about students, one thing that I've been very inspired by is working with undergraduates at my home institution to give them opportunities to tell their own stories of climate change and to imagine their own future after having studied a lot of the literary and artistic responses to climate change. And the material that my students come up with is just really astounding. So they will, for example, read the report that Minal and others authored in 2018 and then create objects to imagine what their future is going to look like or reflect that future and do other sorts of projects like that to sort of really get thinking about this problem of climate change. And many students come into these classes not having ever really thought about this question or not having the scientific expertise to do serious research in that vein, but come away with a real passion or eagerness to communicate and learn more. So I think there's tremendous promise, especially among younger people that I've worked with.
Yeah, I think what's remarkable about this as a topic is that it really can be taught across so many fields and disciplines, and is, somewhat more spottily than it might be, but in history, in literature, in art history, in philosophy, posing a set of ethical strategies for how we're going to make certain decisions. And also in anthropology. And among other accomplishments, I'm thinking now with an anthropological analytic, it can be, finding for us other models of living with so-called nature that we can learn from. And I know this is an important part of something that Mark was talking about yesterday. There are certainly not just people in the past, but people living on the planet right now who have a much more, in Mark's terms, mutualistic relationship with the natural world than a parasitic one.
Minal, would you like to take the question in particular on population and behavioral change, vegetarianism and so on?
Yeah. So there was a question on overpopulation, and so I agree that population is one of the 4 big drivers of emissions. But when you talk about overpopulation, and because you specified India, I wanted to say that we know right now that nearly 70% of people still live in villages, and their consumption is almost like negligible. I mean, I think the data on car ownership is 50 cars for 1,000 Indians. So it's not really the number of people, because all the consumption is happening at the top and the upper middle income. So it's not really the number of people, but it is how people consume. Right? And our recent Ipcc report calls out, because so far we were discussing supply solutions. So how do you change from coal to gas to renewables? How do you make appliances energy efficient, for example? But now increasingly there's a focus on behavioral solutions. And our recent report on climate change and land specifically talks about this issue of switching from a meat-based diet to a vegetarian plant-based diet. And I think there's a whole lot, like Navroz was saying, about behavioral demand side changes, and we don't know enough. I mean, we know that there are these solutions, but we don't know enough about what makes people change their behavior. And there, I'd just like to close on the last point about how scholars from humanities and social sciences can help, is that they bring it out. They make these scientific messages more accessible and understandable to people through different mediums, like Benjamin and Bill were talking about yesterday as well. And that's where we scientists have a limitation, right? There's only so many graphs that I can throw at you, and there's only so much you will accept. And I can produce reports after reports, but it's a collective solution across disciplines that will get us there.
Okay, great. To the organizers, do we have time for one more round, or yes? Okay, all right. This gentleman's been waiting.
In certain countries, asking for climate solutions from the young generation mostly, and some from the old generation also join it. There was this Green New Deal in the US, and there are several strike for climate this young climate activist Greta Thunberg. So how is that actually viewed? Do we actually just listen to it, or do we act upon it? Because leaders usually like the status quo more, like the Green New Deal was mocked in the country as such, where it was required, in the world's largest pollutant actually.
Okay. All right. Any other last questions? Yes, please, here.
Everyone, my question was, we have talked about climate fiction as, so we get that in text. My question is, how much do you think the graphic narratives which are being written right now for climate crisis, how much are they influencing the future generation, and what prospects do you see in the graphic narratives when it comes to influencing people?
Okay, great, thank you. And yes, one final question, and then we'll turn it back to the panel.
So my question is about the behavioral stuff that you're talking about. Amitav Ghosh was talking about the Sundarbans and keeps on talking about how we need to go back to the people to understand, etc., all of that stuff. It's kind of a little hard in the cities to, it seems, to be able to figure out in the way we live, to seek how we can change behaviors because we are trapped in a certain system. But those who live in these types of places, such as the Sundarbans, is the IPCC and others, are they really going, or it seems like from Dubash, Amitav Ghosh discussion, they are not going that much to be able to learn from them. And if we are going, then we should know about that. And if we are not going, then it's, what is the reason? Because should we, and then the question becomes, should we be learning from them?
Okay. Great. Thank you all so much. Let's take a last round of responses. Anybody who wants to pick up any of the questions?
Yeah. Well, when it comes to the question of cli-fi, climate fiction, which can also be, climate fiction represented on film, in graphic narrative, as I think you put it. And the question is, well, what effect is that having? I don't think we know, but I think what we do know is that the more people that we have thinking about this as a topic and as an urgent topic, the better. So Minal and I were just talking this morning about a friend of hers, I believe a friend of yours, who writes children's books, and climate change is the only topic she has. She writes book after book, and that is the topic. If you can imagine not highbrow graphic narrative, but also like comic books. I just think it is a topic that has many narratives within the big narrative, so that it's actually a very narratable topic in many different scales. And so I think there's lots of cultural material to generate from that topic, and I think that is just part of the way we have to imagine inculcating a new generation.
Great, thank you, Bill. Any other comments, Minal?
So I'll respond to the question about whether IPCC takes into account local knowledge, and the answer is yes and no. So IPCC doesn't do its own research. It's an assessment. So we rely, or IPCC authors rely on published material, which is mostly scientific journal and edited books. So there's only so much local you can bring into such a global assessment. Sorry, I was just referring to the question at the back. Yeah, I'll come back to yours if there is time. So the question is, we do need, and I come back to that point about we do need to supplement. I mean, there's only so much one report can do. We do need to supplement with all kinds of other mediums, narratives, fiction, non-fiction, and I think that's where the stories come from. But to be fair to IPCC, which I'm representing here at this panel, is that there is now an increasing emphasis on local and indigenous knowledge. And we recognize, at least there is a recognition that we need this. This is an important aspect, but how much and how far, we're still struggling with that one. Yeah, and on your second question about people in cities, and I go back to what Mark and Bill said about people and nature, but I'll let them talk about it because they just put it in a better way than I do. But I think a man's relationship with nature, I think that's something we need to bring back into cities. But if you wanted to, any of you wanted to take back on that one.
I'm getting a lot of signals from the side, so we're just any last 30-second comments from Mark and Benjamin?
Mark, I think you should talk about the example of living in a more mutualistic way.
Okay, if I can just add then, at the moment, the way that human society is formulated and the way that we consume, we are effectively parasites on the Earth system. As a species, we are parasitizing it, we're using its resources very rapidly, and we're not returning anything to the system, or very little to the system. We have to change that relationship, and we have to change that relationship very rapidly, and we have to learn to develop a mutualistic relationship with the rest of nature, because that's what sustained the biosphere over 4,000 million years of Earth history. And we have to do that in a whole series of different ways, by bringing nature back into a city, by bringing nature back into our agricultural landscapes, allowing areas to go wild, thinking about the way we make buildings and how we might actually make space for life to actually engineering spaces for birds and other organisms. We have to do that very, very quickly. Otherwise, it's a bad situation for all of us.
Great. Thank you all very, very much. Thank you to the organizers. Thank you to the panelists, and thank you particularly to the audience. I think some of the messages we've got, it's a very nice note on which to end, this imagery of sort of a mutualistic rather than a parasitic relationship. And I also want to sort of acknowledge and support and echo the panelists who talk about how energized those of us from prior generations feel by seeing the energy and enthusiasm of the younger generation, but also how ashamed in some senses we are for having let it get to this stage. So please stick around for the next panel if you have the appetite. I think we can continue this conversation. Thank you very much.